Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Justin the Food Entrepreneur Show. I'm Justin Bizzarro. I'm your host. That's Bizzarro. For anyone else out there who's trying to find us, you can find us on Instagram at Justin the Food Entrepreneurs or Facebook. And you can also find us on Spotify or wherever else you grow yourself through podcasts. So we are available on almost every major syndication for podcasts. I got that question again the other day. Yes, we're out there. I'm sure you can find us. And I know we are syndicated through various other podcast syndications depending on the country that they're in. I don't even understand how it all works anymore. It just compounds. So we are out there, guys. So you can find us. For your family or friends who are in a different country that may not have access to the same podcast channels as you do here. With that being said, I have a very special guest with us today from Kentucky. Everyone knows I love Nashville, Kentucky area. We do a lot of conversations from there. I have Sunnyside Egg Company, Patrick Samuels with us. How are you doing today, Patrick?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I love eggs, so this is true to my heart. It's probably my first favorite food. When everyone asks me if I could only eat one food for the rest of my life, the answer hands down is always eggs. For me, hard-boiled, scrambled, sunny side up. Definitely eat them every morning. Definitely when I'm upping my protein, up my egg intake throughout the day. Egg salad sandwiches. I'm like Bubba Gump of shrimp, okay, when it comes to eggs. But I want to lay this on for everyone as we set this episode up and what Sunnyside Egg Company is doing, what Patrick is doing, and I want to lay it out for everyone just to give everyone a scenario of where the world was. When I started the Kaiser Hospitals, or our company did, Food Service Partners, in 1998, Kaiser was on a mission to go as much locally sourced, regenerated, organic, grass-fed, pasture-raised as possible. Okay, this is 1998. Okay. Kaiser at that time, just in Northern California, is doing between 19,000 and 27,000 meals a day. Now, just keep in mind, hospitals, a patient gets 3 meals a day plus 2 snacks. 2 snacks counts as 1 meal equivalent. Okay, in most hospital cases. So that's 4 meals a day on average a patient is getting. Just to give you, it's not 19,000 people. Everyone is, 19,000 people. No. When you have someone in a hospital, you're serving them 4 meals a day. Long-term care home, 4 meals a day. Okay. So when everyone understands you have a restricted audience, but you have guaranteed volume, but you also need to perform. So during the time Kaiser's expanding, Southern California into Washington, they're also in Hawaii. By this time, they're making a push. 2009 comes. We're trying to hit a goal. They decide on all the other goals, this wasn't one of them before, that they need all pasture, grass-fed, outdoor-raised animals, period, across the board. Okay, even though we were going in that direction, 2009 became the date instead of 2025, okay, which is a big difference in goals, because that originally we were aiming for 2025. When that happened, there wasn't enough eggs produced in the United States to serve Kaiser's meals for all their hospitals in one day. There was not. I could not buy it. The grocery stores didn't have enough. No one had enough eggs for me to supply. Think about it. If it's breakfast, 1 of 4 divided by 4, guys, that's about 6,000 meals a day. 6,000 times 2 to 3 eggs. You do the math. It doesn't seem like a lot. But the reality is there wasn't an infrastructure to produce that amount of eggs for us locally in that amount of time every single day. Because eggs go into everything we produced, whether it was sauces, whether it was in a bag going into a soup, maybe an Asian style soup, or it was going into a recipe for pancakes, or whatever it was doing. We were using eggs not only for breakfast, but in everything we were cooking. So I want to just anchor that for everyone. In 2009, when we went to the world to try to find eggs to meet the Kaiser Permanente standards, we could not find enough eggs. And we had to actually go create our own supply chain and ask farmers to switch. We had to find brokers and distributors and people to help us go find people that maybe were out there that were already doing it on a small scale, that we could grab off maybe 6,000 eggs a week or every 2 weeks or once a month just to supplement it. And in the meantime, just so everyone knows, before that, eggs were all pre-cracked in bags. I didn't have the labor. I didn't have to crack them. Now I switch to this. I don't have eggs in a bag. They're not pre-cracked for me. I'm now having to deal with the shells and the thing. That's what it takes to go to something like this, to do it better. But it is better, and it made such an impact on our company over those 9 years. We went in that direction across all of our clients, across the entire world, across the entire scope that we did we start focusing on better farming, better food, regenerative processes. So that's why I'm going to anchor this. That's why this episode is so important to me. I'm going to hand the mic to Patrick. I'm going to allow Patrick to tell his story from when he was a kid to now that he's a farming entrepreneur, food entrepreneur, and producing eggs. But I wanted to anchor the story for everyone on, sometimes we think because we see things or we hear things, we assume we are farther along and the job is done. But the job is not done. And we as individuals have to help the farmers who are doing the job by supporting them. How do we do that? Well, number one, our wallets, but number two, vocally through social media and in our community. So Patrick, story's yours. Let's talk about little Pat.
Sure. Yeah. Well, just to touch on what you were just talking about, just I guess for the audience, the vast majority of eggs raised in the United States are still raised in sort of like a conventional system where, there's millions of birds in a barn or hundreds of thousands of birds in a barn. They're in cages and they never leave the cage, for their entire lives. They certainly never see outdoors or anything like that, but they don't even have the ability to kind of move around. And that's, for commodity eggs, whenever people are looking for, $2 eggs in the grocery store, that's kind of the conditions that you're going to find where those eggs came from. And so everybody loves cheap eggs, but, it's probably also important to understand how those eggs were raised. And so, yeah, it's really valuable for people who, for big companies who are moving from those commodity systems into kind of what's a little bit more of a niche, in the free range or pasture raised area, because then all of a sudden there's huge market demand. And, at the end of the day, it's simply supply and demand. And if there's demand for, more humanely raised chickens and eggs, then there will be more farmers who do it. But until there's demand, it's kind of hard to move a market until the demand is there. So yeah, thanks for pointing that out. But
yeah, I'm going to anchor this one more, and I want you to tell your story, Patrick, but I want to anchor this big time just because it's important, because you just mentioned price, and I want to mention this for everyone because I've learned this lesson myself in eggs and been in the food business as a family my entire life. So when I say this, guys, I'm not kidding. One is I switched over to those type of eggs myself when the company switched over, for the most part. Okay. And when I'm in public or I'm traveling or whatever, it became hard to control it, especially back then, but it's easier now. I can actually find places where I can search out eggs at the restaurants that are served to the standards that I want. Same with bacon, all of that. But I'm going to say this. Being in healthcare, particularly in the hospitals and then in long-term care homes and then retirement care homes across the country, doing some work with some pretty big companies, Manor Care, Linton Gardens, any of the retirement homes that the city of New York manage themselves publicly, those type of things. What I learned, honestly, guys, is in the end, we suffer as much as we sin during our life, period. People that go gracefully, that die peacefully in their sleep, live peacefully, eat peacefully, have peace. Okay, does that mean they don't have suffering and they don't have pain and they don't have hardship, or they don't purposely go into things that are difficult, even though everyone says they shouldn't? No, that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that in their pursuit of life, they react to life differently. They don't react to it in a sinful way. And when they're treating their body as their temple, they're treating it, the food that is provided in this world, they're looking at it as the difference between, well, I can have regular gasoline or I can have the best high octane gasoline. That's what we're talking about here. Both will keep you alive, guys. The question is, how long will your engine last? And then in the end, how abruptly will the engine go? Will it be something where I go and I retire the truck and it's on my terms? Or will the truck retire first, if it's an engine in the gasoline phrase or analogy? So I'm going to emphasize that for everyone, because I will tell you that eating better, having a better lifestyle, no matter, even in Kaiser's situation, which Kaiser dealt with all economic classes and then used ethnic meals to help sell better food. Okay, so we upped the quality of the food in Kaiser. We then matched our audience. We understood our consumer base, and then we got them on better food as they were in the hospital and used to better food through their communities, and then educated them on what we were doing. Kaiser doesn't do this anymore necessarily, guys, just so you know, since the contract has been gone. And COVID put a lot of pressure on everyone, and the volume of food that was needed, everyone took shortcuts. Okay, it's bad business. That is the time that I'm talking about. In COVID was the time we needed to react the way that needed to be, where we could have peace. But we reacted in a way and we took shortcuts, and there's going to be a lot of people without peace. That dying thing that I'm talking about. So just from a spiritual standpoint, everyone, God does not call us to cut corners. God calls us to master the world around us. And in mastery, what he's talking about is no different than an MBA or a master's of business or a master of divinity. It means I'm becoming an expert in the subject matter, and I help whatever it is live on. So the tree, I turn it into furniture, but I grow more trees when I take down the one tree for the furniture. Okay. It's yours, Patrick. Sorry, I wanted to emphasize that because you made such a point about health and choices and the shortcut of price. In the end, guys, I will tell you that cancer, disease, sickness costs you way more than you've ever saved at a grocery store. And in most cases, in the end of your life, you couldn't have consumed enough food, you and your family, that costs the same amount of money as that sickness that takes you in the end. Especially in the United States, where our healthcare costs are insurmountable. You do not eat enough food in your lifetime that will ever outdo that. So if you eat healthy, you could go peacefully. It's not expensive. It doesn't cost the world a lot. It doesn't cost your family a lot. It doesn't cost the healthcare companies a lot. Grace, doing the right thing. The other way costs a lot. And you may think you're saving $2 on 12 eggs or $4 on 12 eggs for your family, but now compound your family in the way you're feeding them in that long-term goal in the end. Are you going to go peacefully? Is that the long-term goal? I don't know. Money isn't going to save it. Money doesn't change it. Poor, rich, doesn't matter. Kaiser, the city of New York, Carillion hospitals, Manor Care, didn't matter. All of them served every economic class. And in the end, everyone is exactly the same from a financial standpoint. The money doesn't matter anymore in the end. However, it is being spent still in the end. And how do we want to go? What is the cost of our death? That's what we have to ask, guys. It's a burden on the world. The way we live becomes a burden to the world when we die, whether we like it or not. So I love you guys. I appreciate you guys. I'm really going to give the mic to Patrick this time. I know that was deep, but that's what I've seen in my life. That's what I believe the importance. And then lastly, sorry, I'm going to get ahead of this. If we do not farm the animals and eat them, we do not have purpose for them. The rhinoceros is an example. Because we did not grow them, we did not farm them, we did not eat them, they are now basically extinct. They only produce every 2 years. It would take them 2 years to do. Cattle's kind of the same way. They are kind of like cattle in the way they roam. Their horn, their rhinoceros tusk or whatever horn is very valuable, so they're killed for those. But we never thought to farm them to keep them alive, because who would want to eat an endangered animal? The reality is if we ate them, they would still be alive because there'd be profitability behind them and there'd be incentive to do it. So we got to be very careful when we think what happens when humans become plant eaters only, if that were true. Because if that were true, we have no use for the animals. And do we then still become master of our domain and follow what we've been commanded to do? So I'm just going to leave that with everyone because for me, I know that parts of the world we eat things that are extinct or are non-existent in other parts of the world that would not be alive if humans didn't eat them. So anyway, Patrick, it's yours. Let's tell your story. Little
Sure.
Pete, this farming adventure, which I love so much.
Yeah. So I was born and raised in central Indiana, and I did not have a farming background when I was really young. My dad worked on some farms, but then he ended up taking a factory job, and that's what he did for, pretty much the remainder of my time at home. And so I really had no farming background whatsoever. Wasn't interested in farming at all. Just was not even, on my radar. Grew up wanting to be in the military, certainly inspired by, 9/11 and that sort of thing. And so graduated high school and went to West Point, which is the, United States Military Academy. And so did 4 years at West Point, graduated and commissioned as an infantry officer, and then went through like infantry basic training, the infantry officer training, and then the ranger school, and then was stationed out in Alaska for a few years, did a short deployment out of Alaska while I was there, and then came back from that and tried out for Special Forces. So there's a like selection process to go to Special Forces. So went to that selection and got assessed and picked up for Special Forces. Moved down to North Carolina, went through about a year and a half of what's called the Q course, which is the like Special Forces pipeline to become a Green Beret. Did that and then was stationed just north of Nashville with 5th Special Forces Group, where deployed, a few more times kind of around the world. And so that was kind of like that was, most of my life leading up to getting out of the military was, basically my entire life was consumed by the military. And during that period, I guess, COVID happened. And, whenever COVID happened, I think maybe everybody, but we certainly took kind of look at our food system. We took a look at health in general. We started questioning, what's going on with all these, vaccines that we get and that sort of thing. And so really we kind of just wanted to learn, because up to that point, particularly in the military, you're kind of just, you eat what you're fed and you take all sorts of vaccines and whatever they give you. And so we had never really cared. My wife and I, she was in the military as well, and we had never really cared. And COVID happened, and then we kind of started looking into the food system and everything like that. And that's whenever we really started to learn about some of the more inhumane practices, kind of in food. And then we started to learn about regenerative agriculture. We started looking at guys like Joel Salatin and Greg Judy and those kinds of folks who were out there, raising animals in a kind of harmonious way with nature. And so that was kind of our dream of whenever we left the military. We wanted to just kind of have a small homestead and do it on a small scale. And so I left the military in 2024, in January of 2024. And we bought a small homestead. We started doing some, small, just kind of backyard chicken, eggs, beef, that kind of thing. I'm on about 9 acres here. And I took a job for one of the big like pasture raised egg companies out there. And started to learn a little bit more about, agriculture, the food system, just kind of like the behind the scenes perspective whenever I worked for that food company. And, that company is doing, what everyone else is basically. So, no harm, no foul to that company in particular by any means. And, they're all actually really great folks from my experience. But what I saw was that the industry as a whole is a little bit deceptive, particularly in the wording and how they phrase things in the egg industry. And so, words like pasture raised, for example, in the egg industry, a chicken or an egg could be pasture raised as long as it has outdoor access to a certain amount of space outdoors. And so it doesn't really matter how many birds you shove inside of a barn or whether the bird ever goes outside or ever even sees daylight, that chicken and that egg can still be called pasture raised. And so when I was there, one of the first questions I asked was, well, what percentage of chickens ever actually go outside? And the response I got back was the industry standard is that less than 15% of chickens in a pasture raised system ever go outside, let alone actually spend, all day, every day out kind of foraging for bugs and, living the life of a chicken and particularly, the life of a bird, which would be kind of falling behind a ruminant animal out on a plain and that sort of system. And that basically is non-existent inside of all pasture raised eggs. So if you go to a grocery store today and you buy pasture raised eggs, there's a, roughly 85 or a higher percent chance that chicken not only doesn't go outside, but has never seen daylight and will never go outside for the entirety of its life. And
so I want to emphasize this 100%. And when I was talking about the Kaiser for everyone in the audience in 2009, this is what I ran into also. A lot of people claiming things and the law allowing them to claim it, yet by my standard, by the standards we had set as a company, by the standards we actually set with Kaiser, it didn't match the standards that we were looking for. And pasture raised became a marketing term, not an actual factual term. Just so everyone knows. What happened in this scenario is when we said pasture raised, what we did is we changed the fundamental meaning and context of the word by changing how we defined it in the farming system in this case. And so when I was assuming pasture raised, we all assume it's 100% or a majority of the time. But the reality is you can say it's pasture raised and only be outside or be a part of a flock that maybe only part of the flock goes outside. That's still pasture raised. So I want everyone to understand what humans we do is we change context of things and we use words that mean something and then redefine them without telling people we've redefined them. Okay.
Yeah. And another point on that too is, now a lot of these big companies will get what they call third-party certifications, certified humane, American humane, whatever it may be, to try to, again, further justify that they are, they're certified pasture raised, for example. Well, the problem with that is that the certifying entity makes money off of the eggs being certified. And so they're financially incentivized to certify the eggs as pasture raised. They're not financially incentivized to critically analyze whether or not the chicken and the egg were actually raised outdoors in any meaningful way. And so, we have creating sort of a self-licking ice cream cone in some ways of like, the company can define pasture raised how they want. And then the certifying agency will basically just confirm, yes, the company, meets the standards that the company set and therefore is pasture raised because we're all just going to call that pasture raised, and so seeing that, kind of drove me to just believe that there was an opening in the market and a niche in the market for two different things. One, hens that were actually raised outdoors, and then two, just transparency in the operation, which is kind of one of our big things. And so right now we have no certifications. We obviously make on-pack claims, but we have no certifications. And in lieu of certifications, what we always say is, if you're a customer, a buyer, Instagram influencer who wants to learn anything like that, then reach out to us and we'll show you the difference between our system and what everybody else does. And the flip side of that too is I don't necessarily have an issue, like me personally, with barn raised hens, because we do have a free range line where we have some small flocks and barns. We still keep those flocks very, very small compared to what the industry standard is, and we do most of that as sort of a service to higher volume clients. Because right now, this kind of goes into the dynamics of like why there's not really a lot of truly pasture raised eggs or, regeneratively raised eggs, is there's no real like logistics chain for that style of egg right now. And so basically what we're having to do is we're having to build the volume with what I call a free range model, which is a chicken with outdoor access. We build the initial volume with that to build the logistics systems, and then we can kind of start to layer on our regenerative systems on top of that, if that makes sense. Just because right now, like the supply chain just simply does not exist for regenerative eggs, and so we're building, essentially a free range base, and then layering our regenerative on top of that, and so far that's working pretty well, and that actually allows us to grow the regenerative market much faster than if we try to do solely regenerative operations from the start, if that makes sense.
Yeah, actually, I agree with this a lot. And I think there has to be some balance, particularly because, listen, in farming in general, guys, if you go farther north, your chickens are going to die in the winter. They're outside. So there needs to be some indoor rotation. Same with pigs. And I know that that's a whole other topic in free range pasture raised pigs, but it's the same idea. But I want to talk about the thing you said before, it's the ruminant, following the ruminant animals, which is important. The grazers, then the animal that comes behind it, there's nitrogen in the poop of the chickens, the hooves of the pigs or the sheep or the cows help push that nitrogen in the soil. They also sequester, regenerative farming sequesters carbon dioxide back into the soil, guys. It helps open it up. It helps get worms in there. It helps loosen it up. It helps aerate. Chickens help with bugs, guys, especially if you're growing other produce on your farm or stuff, even if it's just a family thing. A natural way is just to let chickens run through it, just so everyone knows. And they deal with weeds too. I don't know how or why, but for some reason they really help with produce farming. If you let them every once in a while run around your gardens and pick off the animals. In China, you'll see that all the fields, so produce fields or cornfields or whatever, lots of them just have chickens running around them, eating all the time. They don't use the stuff that we do or need to, because they naturally use the chickens as the pest control. And then they eat the chicken eggs. They go through the fields and collect all the eggs. So just to give the audience aware that there is systems, we are just trying to better them and trying to figure out balance. And also in general, guys, cows are in general grass fed majority of their lives and then finished in the end through corn or grain or whatever. I'm not saying that they should be finished with corn or grain, but what I am saying is it's that little tweak at the end usually, or if it gets really cold and there's not enough grass and the farmers supplement with corn or grain. If there's no supplementing there, in some cases, the animals will die. So we just have I'm very realistic that we need to progress forward. I'm also very realistic that we need to do it within the conditions God has given us.
Yeah. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And this is kind of where, I probably take heat from both sides on my end, because, we are calling out, and in many ways, we're kind of calling out the big guys and saying, well, you're not really what you claim. You're certainly not pasture raised and that sort of thing. But then on the flip side, we also still have some free range barns. And so, there's people on the other side who claim that you should only ever do regenerative. Anything less than regenerative is unacceptable and cannot, should not be allowed, and that sort of thing. But unfortunately, the state that the American food system is in currently, that's just not feasible to just turn a switch on and switch everything over to regenerative systems, overnight. And so that's what we're trying to do is basically, I see egg production as a spectrum. On one end, you've got, caged conventional hens that never move outside of their small little cage. And then on the other end is regenerative. And so, we're just trying to push the market and the supply chain more towards the regenerative systems. And so, yeah, sometimes that requires that we, put in free range flocks just to build our logistics and our supply chain. But then it also allows us to grow our regenerative systems much faster. And I think we're demonstrating that, because I think probably the largest quote unquote regenerative, like truly pasture raised flock in the country right now is probably in the neighborhood of 25 to 30,000 birds all on one farm. And that took, decades and decades for those folks to build. I think we'll probably surpass that number within 2 years. And so we're only able to build, those regenerative systems so fast because we have the logistics and the supply chain built from our free range eggs, if that makes sense. And so we try to be realists. I try not to, I probably get a little too ideological on social media sometimes whenever I'm talking about all of this, but we try to also be very real and very practical in our efforts to understand that, free range eggs are still better than, a conventional caged hen. And so if that's all folks can afford, in some of our markets, then that's what we'll offer. And then, for folks who want and can afford regenerative eggs, well, then we'll offer those in those markets as well. And we'll kind of keep pushing our eggs in that direction.
Yeah, and I like this also because it gives options. If anything, if we really had a blizzard or something, you can move your animals around a little bit. You have some flexibility. I think that that's important, guys. If on one hand we say we want to care about the animals' lives, well, we need to utilize the animals and make sure, but we also need to make sure there's options for emergency situations or to pivot. Like, I will give you an example. I know plenty of farmers that don't use antibiotics on their cows because they're grass-fed, all natural, whatever. But if that cow's about to die and they need to save its life, they are putting antibiotics in that cow and they are moving it into a different rotation. And everyone's like, oh, it's about the money. Some, but it's also about the life of the cow and having a purpose. If it just dies, it has no purpose. If it dies for the purpose of eating and sustaining someone else's life and leading to someone else's substance that leads to nutrients in their life, then that cow served a purpose in God's world, in our world, in anyone's world. So we have to look at that. Did the tree serve the purpose? Am I serving my purpose? Is that chicken serving its purpose and laying its eggs so it can lead to human life, substance, growth, nutrients? That's very important, guys, that we understand this. This is why I anchor that if we don't care for them and we don't eat them, in general, they don't live in our world anymore. Dogs live, well, we do eat them in some cultures, same with cats, but they live because they're our pets. So, and we're less and less people have pets. So we're going to have to figure this out at some point. But let's talk about how you rotate the chickens from a pasture raised standpoint. Let's break down each one in terms of the terms and define it in the way that you use it. Let's do that.
So we use, for our regenerative systems, we use what we call mobile chicken houses, and then we would call the system like mobile regenerative. And the reason we use those words is regenerative in particular kind of points more to what we're doing with the soil. Although I personally would say that term will be more broadly used for a set of practices. So for us in particular, we use multi-species grazing and we use rotational grazing. And that's what we would use to justify our claim as regenerative, is that we use those two systems. And so rotational grazing would be that we move the animals regularly to fresh pasture. And so you're allowing the pasture that you just moved the animals from to rest and to kind of soak in all the nutrients that came from the chickens, manure, and from them scratching and pecking around and that sort of thing. You're allowing the pasture to rest. You're moving your system to your mobile chicken house to a new location, and then the chickens are able to find new bugs, new grass. They have fresh grass to kind of go run around in. They're not in their own manure and that sort of thing, and so they just kind of constantly have access to fresh pasture. And then with the ground, you're regenerating in the soil. So you're taking soil that at one point was nutrient lacking and, probably had a lot of overgrown, may have been overgrown, had a lot of weeds and that sort of thing. And you're allowing animals to just do what they do naturally, which is to repair that soil basically. And so then, if you give your pasture 45, 60 days of rest, well, you can circle back around to that exact same spot. And by the time you get to that same spot of pasture, now all of a sudden you've got fresh grass again, you've got fresh bugs again, your soil's in better condition. And so we use rotational grazing for that purpose, and then we use multi-species grazing. And so a lot of our farms will have ruminants, being mostly sheep or cattle, that we rotate in front of the chickens. And so this is just trying to, our attempt to mimic nature basically, because if you go out to, the prairies, the plains and that sort of thing, and you watch wild buffalo, well, a couple of days after the buffalo move through an area, what do you see? You see birds coming in because they're going to scratch through the buffalo's manure to find, worms or maggots that are starting to grow in there, larvae that are starting to grow in there. And then they're also spreading that manure as they're kind of like scratching it around. They're spreading that manure. And so it's acting as a natural fertilizer. And so, the multi-species grazing, will bring chicken, or if we have grass that's, 8 to 12 inches tall, we'll bring cows into that area. And we'll kind of sell them off with some electric fencing to kind of keep them in that section. They'll munch down the grass until it's nice and munched down. And then we'll move the cows to a new patch of grass, and then we'll bring the chickens in behind them. And so the grass is a little bit shorter, gives the chickens the ability to, look for bugs, scratch through manure, and kind of just basically express the natural behavior of a chicken, And the other piece to that is we use pretty small flocks. Most of our flocks are in terms of mobile coops, are 1,000 birds or less. In the spring, we'll probably start moving to some 3,000 bird flocks, but even those will still be 1,000 birds or less inside of each house, inside of each mobile house. And so that really gives the flock the ability to, have plenty of room to go outside and truly express, the life of a chicken, which is to scratch and peck and look for bugs and live outdoors. So those are the systems that we use. That's kind of the terms that we would use to justify our regenerative claim as well.
One of the things about the mobile houses, I believe now they have solar panels, some of them, and they are heated. So, like I said, if it gets cold outside, the chickens do have warmth, I believe, and water in the mobile coops, correct?
Yeah, it depends on the system that you're using. I mean, we kind of use a range of different of mobile houses, but like the one that I have in my back pasture would have solar powered. It is solar powered, and then it's got water heaters in there, and so the coop itself will not be heated. And we do that for a number of reasons, but with the like, if you've probably seen mine on Instagram, so it's got kind of like a greenhouse cover to it. The nice thing about that is in the wintertime, with that greenhouse cover, it acts obviously as a greenhouse, and so it traps heat inside of that chicken house, and then their body heat will trap it. And so usually it's about in the dead cold of winter, it's generally 15 degrees warmer inside of that chicken house than it is outdoors. And so even if you get, 10-degree temperatures, it's still about 25 degrees inside that coop, which is plenty warm for a chicken. This is one thing that I guess I like to highlight too, is because a lot of the big companies will say, well, because they live in our giant 20,000 bird barns, that's actually more humane because in extreme conditions, the chicken is more comfortable. But if you look at any animal, animals are meant to live in outdoor conditions. Like our cattle, for example. I've got plenty of videos of our cattle happily munching on hay and freezing cold snowstorms. Like they're out there, they do not care. Same thing with rain or as long as they have shade in the summer. Like the animals are they're designed to live outside and be outside. And so it's the same thing with chickens. Is we've never lost a chicken due to like heat exposure because we just always have shade and water for them. We've never lost a chicken due to like cold exposure because they have natural, I mean, that's what their feathers are for. They are naturally designed so that they can withstand environmental conditions. And so yeah, the idea that chickens should live inside of a barn for their own health or something like that, I just kind of push back on the big guys. But yeah, our chickens certainly have plenty of the warmth necessary to keep them safe throughout the winter, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and instinctually, like no different than humans, even though we don't realize this or think this because we rely so much on education or the word, but there is instinctual things that are passed down. It's just the way that are passed down from the animals, and they know how to survive. They've been doing it for a long time. Chickens probably maybe longer than humans, but I don't know. But the thing about the chicken, and the reason I like this a lot also, and what we're talking about, is they're small, there's a great number of them. There's a purpose of all that. Like not only do they have great numbers, they produce a lot of eggs, which we use as a supplement. There's no need in this case to kill the animal. We're just producing the egg, guys. And the more eggs we can produce, it does act as a protein. It does have similar structure when it goes into your body and it's broken down, especially the higher quality it is, as we just talked about. So the nutrients, the diversity of nutrients that an animal or a plant gets is then transferred to the human body. It's that simple, guys. It's not hard to understand this. We all know this to be true. What's in the ground gets transferred into the plant. What's in the plant gets transferred to the animal. What's in the animal gets transferred to the human. There's certain things that pigs can eat that humans can't eat, that pigs turn into things that are beneficial for the human body than when we eat it. And I just want to anchor this while I'm talking about the pigs. When we're talking about the messed up human system, food system, particularly in America, we had probably the best pork system, commercial, organic, pasture raised in the world. Like everyone thinks we're known for our beef, yeah, because of cattle barons, all that, but we are a pork country, guys. We produce pork, a lot of it, and in some weird move, we just sold it to the Chinese for whatever reason, and they closed a bunch of factories. But what we do when we do that, and when we lose those animals, we lose the quality. We lost all the farm raised, pasture raised, prop, whatever number it was, animals for California. And so when we make the decisions, it's not just like, oh well. No, it's like all those farmers, all that land, all those slaughterhouses, all those things are gone. We gave up an industry. Now we have to go rebuild it because that industry didn't stay here. It moved. And what happened is the better pork that was here is now going elsewhere. And now we're getting less quality pork because we're not the ones producing it. So we're not prioritizing ourselves. Now, do I believe in God's kingdom over all kingdoms? Yes. But as a person in the United States, also as believing in God's country here, we need to do better, guys. And if we're going to protect the systems and protect animals and protect God's kingdom, we don't just give it away and then allow all the work that was done in progress to go backwards. Okay. And I just, it's hard. I know as humans, we go forwards and we ebb and flow and empires fall. But at the end of the day, food outlasts all empires. At the end of the day, we still break bread, even if we defeated someone or we ourselves were defeated. We still break bread. We still eat. We still reproduce. We still go on as humans. We still have to take care of animals so we can feed other humans. We still have to do those things. It doesn't stop. So I just want to anchor that for everyone also. Let's talk about building a business when you don't come from farming, gaining the knowledge, the educational piece, because you've got a lot of knowledge in a very short period of time. And I'm not sure if you studied it or started taking interest in it while you were in the military. We talked a little bit about it, but let's talk about this learning curve. We'll go back to what people said in the 80s, the learning curve.
Yeah. So. Well, I'll caveat anything I say with the notion that I generally learn by doing. And so I usually have to fail at a whole bunch of things in order to figure out the right way to do it. That's just the only way that I generally do it. And so, for anybody who's looking to start a business or anything like that, on the entrepreneurship side, my personal, I guess, belief system is that, I just go for it and then I'll kind of build the plan in flight and learn along the way. And so, certainly some of the sort of theoretical and the ideas behind regenerative agriculture I was learning while I was still in the military. I was watching a lot of Joel Salatin videos and Greg Judy videos and reading their books and that sort of thing. But then, you don't really learn until you just start doing it yourself. And so again, we started doing it on a small scale in our backyard or in our back pasture, but that is much different than trying to do, hundreds or thousands of chickens regeneratively or in, mobile coops. And so, for me, the learning curve, has had to be really fast, in particular, and on more so on the sort of like industry side, right? Because my background is all military, and even whenever I worked for that other food company, I saw a little bit of the industry. I knew that there were some obviously like FDA regulations and USDA regulations you had to abide by, and so I could kind of learn some of those things along the way, but a lot of it we've kind of just built in flight. And so a great example of that is like food safety plans, right? Like in my mind, as long as we were using safe practices, we were going to be good to go. And so as long as we, refrigerated the eggs upon collection, and then we transported all the eggs in refrigerated vans, and we stored them in coolers at the grading facility, and we washed them, at the necessary temperatures and everything like that, we would be fine on the food, sort of like food safety side, right? Well, then we start partnering with some bigger retailers, and they're like, "Hey, do you have a HACCP plan?" I'd never even heard of a HACCP plan. I was not even aware that was such a thing that would exist, let alone did we have one on hand.
And what
ready
do
to
all
go.
Those letters mean? And you love acronyms. You love that.
Yeah. It's hazard analysis central control point or something like that.
Exactly. Critical control point, maybe.
Yeah, there we go. And so basically, it's a process to identify what the critical points in your system are, where you might have food safety concerns, right? Like where at what point during the logistics chain are you most likely to have potential salmonella or any kind of like external problems that affect the eggs, right? And so, but the point just being that I didn't even know that term existed, let alone did we have one. And so all of a sudden, basically I have a week to do all of the research and say, okay, what is a HACCP plan? How do you build one? What are you looking for? And so just, that's basically what my evenings turned into, was like at the end of the workday, I would just then spend the evening looking in and trying to learn and then trying to piece one together, and so, yeah, little things like that, those are actually the things that I would say are the hardest on us in terms of learning curve. Is just that, I don't have industry knowledge. I don't have a decade in the food industry where, I've been learning about this for a long time. The on-farm practices, in my opinion, are kind of the easier to pick up because there is kind of a wealth of knowledge out there on YouTube and in books, and you'll just kind of learn as you go, how often do you need to move your coop to make sure that you're not putting too much pressure on your land, and how often do you need to put fresh water in, all of those kinds of things are pretty simple to figure out. For us, the learning curve really has been trying to compete with, the big names in pasture raised eggs while we're still small and our staff is comprised of, me by myself. So, that's really where the learning curve, because that is our goal. Our goal is to offer regeneratively raised eggs at a, wide scale. And so in order to start competing with all of the big guys, we have to have all of the same things that they have in place, but we have to do it with no staff, no venture capital, no investment funds, no banking. We're not leveraging, and so that's where a lot of the learning curve comes into play. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think this is amazing because, one, I don't know that change or bettering of an industry can happen sometimes when there's too much compounding of traditional knowledge. What I would call tribal knowledge in some way. Only those who are in it know it, and it's not really written down very well anywhere, and no one really knows, and you still need it. However, in the world that we're living in now as farmers, I'm going to emphasize this for everyone because I grew up in farming, know a lot about it, spend a lot of time working with farmers, sourcing locally, particularly in New York, Virginia, Texas, and California, in those markets, Georgia. And the thing is, you have to own your own brand, and you have to own your own way of getting your product out there more than ever before. You can't just pass it to a third party or sell the cow to someone and have them slaughter it and then it gets USDA on it and you move forward. It doesn't build farms, guys. That just builds, I don't know how to say it in a way. It just builds something that won't have legacy. It won't be able to stand up in the long run, and it certainly won't be able to stand up to the Saudis, the Chinese, and every other country that's trying to buy farmland in the United States right now. Why do I say that? Why am I saying it with importance? Because in any business in today's world, with AI, with technology, with all the resources at our fingertips that we just discussed, I partly set up this question on purpose for this next part, but the willingness to learn, to adapt, to grow, to change, to work with the world around us has greater potential than ever. ChatGPT, if you use photos and you do your farm, it will help you initially with your farm. You want to check it, you want to do your research, you want to cross-check it against experts, but it will help you in a way that we've never been able to be helped before. Okay, grow tomato plants. What is this pest on my plant? Photo, instant information, tells you how to deal with it. Okay, so we can deal with things without jumping to whatever the major company tells us to do, Roundup, whatever. We can find solutions in our regions at our fingertips because of the consolidation of information and knowledge through AI. Okay, that's very important. Gemini on Google, I prefer that one, but I just said ChatGPT because I'm sure everyone knows that one. The reason that I'm saying this is because individually, as Americans, in the world that we've built, that we've allowed to be built on here, or we've allowed to be built in the world, as a world, all of our world listeners, it's important that we understand that as AI takes over jobs, as things happen, there's other ways of living our lives. We use the word homesteading in this episode. What do I mean by that? That means at first we're growing enough for us. Okay. Well, growing enough for us gets pretty easy. Let's grow enough for more. Okay, let's make this where we have the ability, where we can have jobs, but maybe we have other ability to live and we're growing food. Okay. The way of the world is not industrial farming moving forward with things like hydroponics, aquaponics, us understanding rotational farming, regenerative farming. We can do a lot in a small piece of property. 5 to 20 acres does a lot, guys. With a lot of animals, goats, sheep, whatever, it's endless. The reason I'm saying this is because how do we build in there? How do you build a company that's 9 acres and compete against farms and chicken coops that are on tens of thousands of acres?
Yeah.
Well, you tell your story, right? Go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. I mean, it's a great question because, and this is something that
I love it.
Kind of goes back to what you were talking about with like institutional knowledge, right? Is that the institutional knowledge will say, well, one semi truck is 20,000 chickens worth of eggs. And so you put 20,000 chickens worth of eggs on a farm. That's what you do. Okay. Well, in order to do that, you have to have X amount of acres and yada, yada, yada. Well, we kind of took the approach of like, and this is actually one of my big critiques of the sort of regenerative agriculture movement in the United States. And this is again where I'm kind of in the middle a little bit, because I look at the regenerative agriculture movement in the United States and I look at a lot of the big names in regenerative agriculture. A lot of those big names inherited farms from their family members who bought them in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And so they might be third or fourth generation farms, but they don't have the massive farm payment that if I were to buy the same amount of that same piece of land today, that I would have to all of a sudden cover, right? And so their farm payment is either substantially less or it's non-existent. And so they're able to take a risk on some of these more, regenerative practices and selling off their own farm because they're not burdened by that farm payment. And so for people like me who say, well, I do want to start a small farm, but I'm not going to be able to be able to afford hundreds of acres to do this on a large scale by myself. How do we kind of bridge that gap, still compete with the big guys, but do it, on my 9 acres here? Well, the answer to that is community. And so this is what, a lot of the big companies also don't understand. And this is why we've had, quite a bit of success here recently recruiting a lot of farmers, is because we understand the value of community, and particularly a lot of the like Amish and Mennonite communities, is that if you can build a relationship with a community, well, then all of a sudden you go from having maybe one farmer to 4 or 5 farmers in an area. And so rather than saying, hey, I need, 100 acres to put 20,000 birds on all at once because that's one truckload worth of eggs, we can say, hey, we can put together, 20,000 birds worth of chickens in an area, in a community, all within 20 minutes of each other. We can still get that truckload, but we can do it. Each farm will be 10 acres maybe instead of 100 acres. And so just through simply developing a little bit of a community, we've been able to bypass a lot of the sort of like industrial standards for how many acres or how many birds you want to have on single farms. And so we keep our flock small. It gives the farmer the ability to not have to go into millions of dollars in debt to build a giant barn or to buy all the land necessary. And so now all of a sudden, if you're an Amish farmer and you've got an extra 10 acres in pasture that all you've been doing is cutting hay off of for the past couple of years, well, now you have a secondary source of revenue for your, on that same piece of land that you really didn't have to take that much money for investment on. So yeah, overall, I just think that we place a lot higher value on community and partnering with other farmers and that sort of thing, rather over sort of the, industrial standard of, well, there's one farm, let's put 20,000 birds on it. So yeah, we've been able to bypass a lot of things just by doing things slightly differently.
Yeah. And I'm, for the most part, not plants, but I'm going to talk about animals a little bit. In the United States, when we were growing into the West, we had territories, Wyoming being one of them in particular, or Montana or wherever, that you didn't need to own land. As long as you owned cattle, they could free graze on the land. And so the cattle barons came up where they didn't actually own land. They just owned the animals, and a great amount of wealth was gained. A lot of international investment. There was a winter and people lost a lot of money over 2 years, which I just talked about. What's the risk? But one of the things that happened is because they didn't have any restrictions on land, they were able to grow these giant corporations because they didn't own the land, and they were more like businessmen versus farmers. Okay. And this in particular movement in the cattle association, the cattle movement in the United States, it's part of the reason our beef is some of the best in the world, but it's also part of the reason the food industry is so foobarred, for lack of a better term. And I'm not going to say what that means. I'm going to let everyone look up what foobar means. But the reason that that happened is because we set this standard of industrial look at farming, even with the land, that the more land we have, the more number of animals we can have, but it's still mono farming, no different than monocropping. We're mono animaling. And mono-animaling ultimately destroys the grazing lands that the animals are on because there's not other animals on there to help regenerate the soil. So I'm going to ask this question to you. Let's talk about regenerating the soil. You've mentioned it a few times. It's something you're conscious of because regenerative farming is for the purpose of the soil. But I would also say it's for the purpose of regenerating better legacy of animals, hopefully, as well. But let's talk about this. How are you doing it? What's the purpose of it? Why? And
Yeah.
why are you making it part of your mission?
Yeah, well, you brought up a great point that it's more than, at least to me, and it sounds like to you as well, it's more than the soil. You hear the sort of regenerative label obviously applies to the soil, but to me, it's a little bit more indicative of a stewardship style, and that's what really matters to me is more the stewardship. Of course, again, if you bring ruminants into an area, you let them munch down the grass, they drop manure on that grass, then the soil is going to soak up the nutrients, so you're getting a natural fertilizer. And then you bring in chickens behind those ruminants, they scratch through the manure, they spread it out, and then they're dropping their own manure, which has kind of like different chemical balances than the cattle manure. And so you're getting this nice, like, perfect natural fertilizer on your pastures, which is going to soak into your ground, and then it's going to, again, just act as a natural fertilizer for your grass and your pasture. You'll see, a variety of different grasses start to come up all of a sudden. You'll see some like deep rooted native grasses start to come up. You do get all of those sort of soil benefits from rotational and multi-species grazing. But to me, and I think you kind of touched on it, was, to me, the value is truly in the stewardship, not just in the soil itself. Because if the goal was just the soil itself, that is a good goal to have, to sort of, because we're going to have problems with our topsoil in the near future, and all of our monocrop systems and that sort of thing. There is value in trying to build healthier soil, to build a more robust, grass profile on your pastures and that sort of thing. But to me, it's more about the stewardship, because I know that this production style, where we're actively moving cattle, sheep, chickens around pasture, and we're allowing the chickens and the animals to have a more natural life that's in accordance with expressing their natural behavior, that requires more stewardship from the farmer, and it requires the farmer to be much more in tune with the health of that animal. And so what we generally see is a much healthier egg and a much healthier flock from these truly pasture-raised systems, because the farmer is out there in the flock every single day. If you can kind of contrast that with even our own free-range system, or the really big companies' free-range pasture-raised systems, you could have 20,000 birds in there, and the chicken, or the farmer, never sees the vast majority of chickens, because the chickens are just in the barn, and that farmer maybe walks through the barn, maybe doesn't. And so they don't really have a good, like a true relationship with the animal. And I think that's what really truly separates our practices. Again, there is value in sort of regenerating the soil and the natural practices that occur to drive that. But the real value is in the stewardship and the relationship between the farmer and the animal, to produce not only like a high quality egg. Obviously that's what we want to produce, but you kind of touched on it a little bit, is really we're benefiting both the animal and the farmer through those practices. And then whenever, we've had the opportunity to have a handful of different people come out and see our farm, whether that's, buyers for some of these companies, or we've had some like Instagram influencer kind of people who want to come out and just learn about what our practices look like, and so then we get to share. What I really love to do is I like to take them to my farm, show them what our flock looks like when it's, truly regenerative and pasture raised, and the chickens are all outdoors. And then I take them to one of our free range farms and I say, well, this is what everyone else calls pasture raised. And like, yes, the animals do have outdoor access. Yes, this is more humane and an affordable way for us to offer eggs in the grocery store. But you can clearly see a vast, vast difference between these two systems. And it can be pretty shocking for people, I think, whenever they see what everyone else calls pasture raised and then what we do, just because, again, whenever you walk out into one of our fields where there's, 1,000 chickens out roaming around. We've got an Amish farmer who's got 1,000 birds in a pasture raised flock right now. And those chickens are just, they're up in the trees, they're scratching around, they're out, they're just all over the place. Like, it looks like a chicken utopia out there. You see that, and then you see what everyone else calls pasture raised. It can be a bit shocking for folks sometimes just to truly see the contrast between the two systems. And yeah, I think that's what kind of really separates us.
Yeah, and I have to give it to the Amish. Honestly, now that they're using solar power and they use propane and stuff, they're figuring out a way to make it work in their system and buy farmland and compound wealth and do it as families. And this is what I'm talking about, guys. I'm glad you brought up the Amish. As farmers, as homesteaders, I'm going to anchor this, actually. I'm going to just pull the whole point together. We need to come together as community. That's how it works in the first place. Many beef companies, even pork companies, are just collection of farmers who grow to the system that the company sets, that main company sets for them. And collecting together in our systems, in our communities, is important, because if we're all growing something and we all grow it, we can grow a lot of other things and have our other specialties. But if we're all in unison, maybe we're all growing beef, chicken, pork, goat. Okay, maybe we don't have the same variety of animal or species, but we're growing them. Okay, and when that's compounded, well, then it's a lot easier for companies to do business there because we're clustered. It's a lot easier for us to build a business and go out and market it. And more importantly, if there's more of you, if there's the 10-acre, 100-acre scenario we're talking about, there's 10 family stories that are being told on Instagram, on Facebook, potentially to your neighbors, to your family, friends in other states. That's impactful. People in corporations don't do that. They don't have the power to tell their story. But we, as entrepreneurs, as farmers, we do. And then I'm going to take it right into my point, and I'm going to take this leap for everyone. It's going to be a giant one. In my world, God works things out strategically in time, in patience. Love being patience. And theologically, for me, God arms us along the way for the greater purpose. I'm going to give everyone an example. Everyone knows Mark Cuban. Okay, everyone knows Mark Cuban is on the Shark Tank. Everyone knows Mark Cuban owns the Dallas Mavericks. Okay, why did the guy get $1 billion? Why is he this tycoon? Why is he yet somewhat familiar? He wears a t-shirt and jeans and sneakers unless he has to be on the TV show, because they give him a hard time because he used to show up to the TV show in his normal outfit, t-shirt, jeans, sneakers. He only wears suits on that show. But let me emphasize this for everyone. What all of a sudden is he doing since COVID, since the world changed? He's cheapening the pharmaceutical business, and he's making pharmaceuticals that aren't normally available because of blah, 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 BS politics available on a greater scale. Maybe even on a worldly scale, he's going to flatten the world pharmaceutically. Okay? Pharmaceutical shots, whatever aside, if we have cheaper options and it's available, we at least have a choice. Freedom, will, human free will. What are we talking about? We at least need to have the choice to better our lives. So this is where I'm going to emphasize this for Patrick. Military training, very specific military leadership training, even further military training, very specific. I don't even know how many years. We didn't talk about it. The leadership skills gain there, the ability to have to go into situations, not here, build community, for example, build trust, work your way around, deal with chaos, bring structure to chaos, or act within chaos with a leveled head, is all the skill sets we're talking about here. Okay. What is it going to take in the United States to change, to keep doing it? Well, we haven't seen the Purdue of this industry. There was a face, a name, a leader, a human, and Purdue is still a collection of farms. It's not just the Purdue farms, just so everyone knows. But this is why I want to emphasize this, and why when I saw what we're doing here at Sunnyside, the important thing is it's more than just what someone's building. Someone's learned very quickly. Someone has the skill set to do it. And then someone has the ability to bring together a community and build a brand, and has a vision that he can execute, and knows how to set up the tasks and the steps and the little things that are necessary to accomplish a mission. And I'm going to just talk about this, and I'm going to ask you this question, Patrick. Let's anchor leadership, mentorship in your life, military, non-military, in the importance of that in your life, because it's very important in what you're doing. And I want to emphasize for the audience the importance of leadership, structure, discipline in our education. And I don't mean just formally, I mean in who we are, because you've done all that. Let's talk about that in you and who you are.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think, first and foremost, if you're going to be a leader in any organization, military, business, whatever it might be, most fundamental to that is you have to have your own vision for what the future looks like. And that's what you drive everything off of, and so whenever you start talking about, bringing on other people or employees or farmers or whatever it might be, you have to be able to kind of unify everybody around that singular vision. And if everybody's not on board for that vision, then that's whenever your company is going to go off tracks. That's whenever, in the military, your unit will kind of go off tracks. If everybody kind of has their own picture of what things should look like, well, then that's what they're going to start moving towards. And so, most critical in my perspective is developing a vision for what the future looks like, and then driving everyone towards that vision for the future. And so, for us in particular, our sort of like central goal is to make regeneratively raised eggs widely accessible, nationwide, hopefully at some point. And so everything that we do is driven by that goal first and foremost. And so, whenever we're making decisions about, how many birds do we order? How do we get our birds? How do we, what kind of cartons are we going to use? All of those little pieces of the puzzle are all driven by our sort of unified vision that we have for the future. And so once you have that, then all of a sudden, once you know your destination, then you can start building the plane in flight is kind of how I would describe it, because at the end of the day, the game of entrepreneurship is that you're never going to have a complete flight ready plane the moment you take off. You're always going to be building pieces of the puzzle in flight. And so, but as long as you know where you're going, well, then you can know, what it's going to take to get there. And so that's that, for me personally, that's kind of been the big transition moving from military to business is taking that concept and applying it to the business. It was fairly easy in the military just because, at the end of the day, you're sent into a foreign country to accomplish certain things. And so you can kind of look at that, the list of things that the government needs accomplished. And you could say, okay, well, let's build our plan off of that. But in developing a business, it's truly yours. And that is one thing that for me was a reason that I left working for another company, was that I just personally wanted to build something that was, whether it works or whether it fails, it was something that was mine, that I created from scratch. We literally started with a handful of chickens in our backyard. We've got nearly 7,000 birds now. And then our goal is to be at 25,000 by 1 year from now, and probably, closer to 40 to 60,000 2 years from now. So, all of that is driven by just having a vision that we can work off of. And then, yeah, kind of going back to one of your other points, you mentioned going in and building relationships, that and almost everything we do, whether that's, our personal life, business, or whatever it might be, the ability to build relationships is certainly one of the most valuable skills that you can have. And so I was fortunate that that's a lot of what I was doing in the military, was going into foreign cultures and meeting with people who maybe weren't so friendly to the United States, and building relationships with them to the point that, we could work together and do things together and get them on board for the vision that we had. And so now, I'm just essentially replicating that. And even this past weekend, I went out to Eastern Kentucky I thought I was meeting with 2 farmers out there. It ended up being 12 farmers that showed up. And, again, people who knew nothing about me, I know nothing about them. And you have to find a way, within, 20, 30 minutes to basically build a relationship with those folks, unify them around your vision, get them on board, and then, uh, figure out a way that works for everybody to kind of partner together and yeah, and work toward the vision. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, what about mentorship? Do you have leaders, anyone that invested in you in particular that you felt that has helped you grow into the leader that you are?
Not really. For me personally, it's been a little bit of a solo endeavor. I'll caveat that with there's an Amish community here locally, and one of the farmers he actually farms for the company that I used to work for, and he and I were friends before I ever worked for that company. But from a farming perspective, from the sort of like on-farm practices, I've certainly gained a lot of knowledge and assistance from that community. So I've been able to maybe surpass a little bit of the knowledge gap that I had in terms of on-farm practices just by learning from those guys really fast. But in terms of, maybe business or anything like that, I tend to just read a lot and I try to apply, I make the assumption that if somebody has been successful in business and that I can value from their perspective. And so, yeah, I try to read a lot. I try to just kind of stay constantly learning. And that's not to say that I haven't had people who have, certainly helped me out along the way. But in terms of having like a close mentor or anything like that, somebody who I can go to with, questions about next steps or whatever it may be, that has not really been a part of my journey for me. It's been very much just try something, fail, try something else, fail, try again, fail, and then maybe, down the line you figure out what actually works. And that's largely been my experience. So yeah, my mentorship comes largely from failure.
Do you worry about predators for the chickens and stuff? That's always a question I get when I've dealt with it. And so I just pass on the question.
Yeah, particularly in our system, we have certainly more susceptibility to predator loss just because our chickens are more outdoors more often. We have ways to mitigate that. One, like our farm, we use livestock guardian dogs. And one thing we found is that if you use a temporary fencing around the chicken coops, so if you may have seen it online, but sometimes we use like a mobile netting, like a fencing that we can kind of move around with as we move the chicken coops. What we found is that keeps the chickens close enough to the chicken house that if a hawk flies over, they can kind of flock back to the chicken house and take cover. And then it also kind of helps prevent ground predators from getting in if they do get into our pastures as well. And so that's what we encourage all of our farmers to use, is that kind of mobile netting. And that's helped mitigate a lot of predator loss, just that alone. But, I would say from a industry standpoint, we probably lose at the same rate that the rest of the industry does. Inevitably, if you let chickens outdoors, you'll have some predator loss, but yeah, we try to mitigate it as best as we can.
Yeah, and I mean, it's natural, number one, for everyone. I mean, there's still the lions out there hunting the gazelle.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but the reason I asked it, and I just want to emphasize it for everyone, is because we assume the chicken hasn't been the chicken for thousands of thousands of thousands of thousands of hundreds of thousands of years. So the chicken has somehow survived without man before man put it into industrial farming. And as we just had them around our farms, so they have instincts to protect themselves. We just got to operate within those instincts. And so the netting, the house being nearby, there being warmth in there by the body heat, these are all things that they know. The chickens know what to do. They're not stupid. They don't know. They're not like, oh, it's snowing, I don't know whether to go inside. No, they know to go inside. So
yeah, and we see that a lot, particularly with hawks is maybe the most obvious one, is that chickens, just like you said, chickens naturally know they have predators. And so if a bird flies over, we see this even with things that aren't hawks, geese or turkey vultures or wild birds that fly over. If birds fly over the flock, usually one of them will make a little squawk noise, and they all know that means there's a predator, and then they all just kind of start running for the chicken house,
Velociraptors in Jurassic Park.
Yeah,
They move that way.
yeah, that's exactly right. And so, yeah, it's kind of entertaining to watch sometimes. We actually have there's a group of truckers, I guess, who just know that because we live right off a highway, and there's truckers who drive by sometimes and they honk their horns. And I don't know what it is about that noise in particular, but it must sound like some sort of predator to a chicken. Because if truckers honk their horns as they drive by, then the chickens do the same thing. So it's kind of entertaining sometimes to watch them. Like, whenever they get that alert and they know that there's a predator, somebody in the flock spots a predator, well, then they all just, flock to the coop to get out from underneath it. So it's pretty entertaining.
Maybe it was when they were going off in the slaughterhouse or something, some beeping of the horn instinct. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know, but it's a stretch for sure. But odd things happen. We still think we're falling out of a tree when we're sleeping. So
yeah.
Patrick, is there anything that I didn't cover that you wanted to cover on this episode? Anything you want to mention about your brand, your story that we didn't cover?
One thing I always like to touch on in sort of like the industry is, because this is a misconception that I hear a lot, is that if you go to a grocery store and you buy pasture-raised eggs and the yolk is like a dark orange, most people associate a dark orange yolk with nutrient-dense yolk as a result of getting the protein from bugs out on pasture. And so what usually darkens a yolk is methionine and like the proteins found in insects. And so that's what naturally darkens a yolk on a chicken. And so a lot of people in a grocery store will go to a grocery store, maybe they've bought conventional eggs and it's like a really pale yellow. And then they go and they buy one of the pasture raised eggs from one of these companies and it's a really dark orange. And they say, oh, well, clearly, this chicken was out on pasture because its orange is really dark. The reality to that is that all of these companies put ingredients in their feed to artificially darken their yolks. And so that could be paprika, it could be marigold. If they're not organic, then it can be just a chemical that they put inside the feed. And so these companies know that customers look for a dark yolk. And so we've even had companies approach us and say, hey, would you like they call it yolk pigmentation is what they call it. But what it is these companies know that customers are looking for a dark yolk. And so they put ingredients in the feed to artificially darken their yolks. And so don't assume if you're a customer, just because you crack an egg that says pasture raised on it and it's got a dark orange yolk, that it was actually raised out on pasture, or that it's any more nutrient dense than a conventional egg that you buy for $2 in the store. So don't pay $12 for eggs when in reality what you're getting is like a $1 $2 dozen eggs, just because the label is fancy and just because the yolks are dark. So I always try to put that out there just as kind of like an education, or maybe an education, if you will, type of a thing for customers, just because the companies out there are doing all sorts of things to try to make customers believe their product is something that it's not. So we're trying not to do that.
No, and I think discernment is the word here that is important. If you're Christian and you're called to live that way, especially with the way we feed our bodies, our temples. Again, I'll go back to the gasoline. But ever since Kroger and Piggly Wiggly basically invented the modern day grocery store, we've become out of touch if we're not on the farms, if we're in. And as humans, I'm going to emphasize this for the restaurateurs, the chefs, and everyone on the show as well, trusting the salesperson or trusting something is just not great practice in the food business. Okay. And I'm going to say this, and I understand, because doing hundreds of millions of dollars in food, but having the diverse menus that I need to have across diets for hospitals and long-term care homes, because, for example, if you had a kidney problem, you can't eat potatoes, you're on a renal diet, and you're trying to find universal ways. So, for example, put chicken on the menu, all the chicken's grilled, but how do you vary it across each diet? Well, you change the sauce. Okay. So everyone's getting it different. How do you continue to change it? Sauce. Okay. Vegetables, change the vegetables, give options seasonally. It helps people get healthier in the hospitals if you use things that are grown in that season. Just want to emphasize that for everyone. But what I am saying for everyone, because I lost my train of thought a little bit, is how we eat, how we choose to eat, how we look at it, how we discern our way through it, it's important. We should know where our food's coming from. We should know what's feeding our family. If we have children, that's feeding our legacy. That's setting the standard of eating habits, discernment in eating in the future. We take shortcuts. Shortcuts are putting pigment in the chicken's feed so the yolks are darker. That's called cutting corners. Keep saying this. Play stupid games, get stupid prizes. That's what we're doing, guys. We're playing stupid games and we're getting stupid prizes. Not us, our kids, our legacy, our future, whatever. But in the restaurants and as chefs, we need to go look into where our food is sourced from. One of the greatest things that ever happened to me as we did SQF in all of our kitchens, massive kitchens across the country, anywhere from 7,500 square feet to 123,000 square feet to 200,000 square feet. One of the best things I ever did was go look at where my stuff was actually coming from, get to know my vendors, get to know the farms that those vendors worked with, and then start to look at it. Because when push came to shove and COVID happened and all those things happened and the food system fell down the tubes and all of a sudden my hospital counts tripled. Yeah, they tripled during COVID. And the food chain fell apart, not to mention no one's working or farming or everyone's panicking and closing their businesses, so I can't get suppliers on the phone. If I didn't have those relationships directly with farms or some of these people, we would have never had food for the hospitals. Okay? And in the end, guys, every business, every healthcare system that was building a better sustainable system folded under the pressure of quick money, expanding their profit because there were so many people in the hospitals. It was easier to do business with a celebrity like Magic Johnson and take a shortcut and use him to drive business than to go back on what you had built, which was 24 years of a sustainable regenerative food system for your hospital system. Money does strange things. Chaos does crazier things. And when everyone panics, we make really, really, really bad decisions. We sell our pork companies. We take a 24-year food system we built in a healthcare system and we throw it all away because a celebrity is going to put his face on us. It's crazy, crazy math, guys, but it's human math. It's nonsensical math. So, Patrick, where can they find you online? Where can they get your eggs? How can they learn more about you? How can they reach out to you? How can they come visit you? All of those things.
Yeah, you can find us online, sunnysideeggco.com. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook at Sunnyside Egg Co. is the handle. And then, yeah, if you want to come see one of our farms, then please, by all means, reach out to us on Instagram or through the website, and we can schedule you for a farm visit. If you're right now, all of our eggs are sold in Nashville, Clarksville, Hopkinsville, and Bowling Green, and kind of the surrounding areas around there. I'm not going to announce it yet because we're not on the shelves yet, but we will be on some major health food stores here in the near future and some major retail shelves here in the near future. And so, yeah, stay tuned for those. But if you are in the Nashville, Clarksville, Hopkinsville, or Bowling Green areas and you go to kind of some local mom and pop stores, local health food stores, and then, you'll probably see us on the shelves.
I'm going to let you close us out. I do a close out, but I'm going to ask you this. Why do it better? Why not do it the conventional way on your farm? Why?
A couple of reasons. One, I think that, first and foremost, the nature of being an entrepreneur is offering to the customer what the customer wants. And so the food industry, by and large, not just in eggs, has been deceiving customers in an attempt to profit off of their lack of access to both information and the farm itself. And so part of this is just customer driven, and that I think that customers want a certain product and they're being deceived into believing that they're getting that product. And so we are trying to offer what customers actually want for the same price that they're currently getting it or better. And the second piece of that is, I kind of touched on it before, which is stewardship. I think that we have a role, and that if we're going to farm, if we're going to produce food, if we're going to create something, then we have a responsibility to do that in the best, most meaningful way possible, and the way that is most harmonious with nature. And so, yes, you can produce eggs, millions of birds at a time in a giant barn with a whole bunch of cages. You can do that, but I think for me personally, my belief is that we ought to do things in a more harmonious, more natural way. And so we are seeking a way to produce eggs in a way that it allows animals to express their natural behavior, allows animals to spend time outdoors every day, in nature, the way that it was meant to be, in a harmonious way at a large scale that makes it available to everybody to purchase on grocery store shelves. So yeah, that's why.
Love it. Everyone, like, share, comment on the episode if you like it. Follow Sunnyside Eggs. They're online on Instagram. There'll be all the links to their website, to their locations. By the time this episode comes out, maybe we'll know their stores that they're in. I can link that below as well. And then for everyone, listen, this show's free. I put it out for free. I cover all the costs. The entrepreneurs come on here for free. They give their knowledge away, their story, obviously to promote their brand, but also to help all of you in the audience. We don't ask for anything, but you should help out the entrepreneurs. Like, share, comment on what they're doing. Try their products. When you're visiting Nashville, go find the eggs, try it, do an Airbnb, cook for yourself. Nashville has a lot of great farms, a lot of great food, a lot of great local food. Try it. So listen, venture out. Also, in terms of the podcast, like, share, comment on it, subscribe, share it with someone who might need it, other chefs. That's how we get the message out there. Why am I saying this? Lastly, as entrepreneurs, we have more impact and influence in the food game than anyone else, particularly in restaurants. You deal with vendors, you deal with farmers. How many of those do you impact? How many customers do you impact? How many employees do you impact? How many legacies within that 4 groups I just said do you impact alone? How many families? It's important that we understand the power and the gift that's been given to us as entrepreneurs. And we talked about stewardship. Be the steward of your community, be the steward of your business, but use the gift that God's given you and the opportunities God has given you in your business, in your family, in your skill set to do more with it, to better others' lives. And that's what this podcast is about. So thank you, Patrick, for coming on the show. Thank you, everyone, for listening in. We're out.